This is a story about my grandmother. From the moment I can remember, she was the warmest presence in my life. She lived in an old house in the suburbs, surrounded by rose bushes and lavender, with a kitchen that always smelled like sweet, buttery cookies. Every holiday, I'd count down the days until I could stay with her. She called me her little sunshine, ruffled my hair, and brought out a tray of freshly baked chocolate chip cookies, the best I've ever tasted. The summer I turned 14, I had a huge fight with my parents and packed a bag to stay with my grandmother, whom I hadn't seen in 2 years. The old house was just as I remembered. As I stepped through the door, the air still carried that familiar cookie scent, but this time, it was tainted by something burnt and metallic, like rust. Grandma stood at the doorway, smiling with the same gentle expression, but her eyes, they were brighter than I remembered. Too bright, and naturally so. Her glasses caught the afternoon light, and for a moment, I couldn't see her face clearly. "Little sunshine," she called, "come give Grandma a hug." Her voice sounded like it was pushed up from deep in her throat. I walked over, and her hug was tighter than I remembered, almost crushing. I thought nothing of it, assuming she'd just missed me that much. But that night, things started to feel wrong. That first evening, I overheard her on the phone with my parents. She told them she'd look after me for a few days. I felt relieved. I wasn't ready to go home. But I couldn't sleep. I tossed and turned until I heard a thunk. Thunk, thunk coming from the kitchen. Like someone chopping something. I crept to the top of the stairs. The kitchen light cast a dim glow against the hallway wall. "Grandma," I whispered, no answer. But the chopping stopped. I turned to head back to my room, and heard whispering behind me. "Not sweet enough. Need more sugar. Meat should be sliced thinner." Chills ran down my back. I bolted into my room, unlocked the door. The next morning, she acted like nothing had happened. She brought me a plate of cookies. "Just for you, little sunshine, baked last night." The cookies were slightly burnt. I took a bite and crunched down on something hard. Bone, maybe. I pretended not to notice, spitting it into my napkin when she wasn't looking. She watched me with a tight smile. Something black gleamed between her teeth. "Grandma, did you sleep last night?" I asked. She only smiled and touched my cheek. On the third night, I had a dream. The kitchen walls were lined with hanging animals, blood dripping down into the cracks of the tiles. My grandmother stood there kneading dough, her face no longer human. It was a pale mask with no eyes, and her mouth stretched all the way to her ears. She hummed a lullaby as she worked the dough. When I woke, there was something red on my hand. It smelled like iron. I wanted to run, but she was always near me. She wouldn't let me leave. "It's too hot outside," she said. "Little sunshine might get burned." Every day, she baked more cookies, weirder ones, misshapen and oily. One afternoon, while she was in the basement, I sneaked into the kitchen and opened the oven. Inside weren't cookies, but a pile of charred, blackened things. Like tiny animals, burnt to a crisp. I gagged. I ran upstairs to pack my things. But she was already on the stairs, blocking the way, holding a blood-stained apron. The smile on her face had completely warped. "Where are you going, little sunshine? You haven't finished your cookies." I stepped back, slipped, and fell. She started coming down, one step at a time, fingers clawed around the banister. Her knuckles bent like hooks. "Grandma's cookies. Only you ever loved them, right?" She shoved a cookie into my mouth. I tried to spit it out, but I felt fur. I coughed it up. It was full of hair. I kicked her off and bolted. I locked the back door and grabbed a chair to smash the window. But the glass wouldn't break like it had been enchanted. Her footsteps creaked from the floor above. She was singing the same song from my childhood, but now it sounded like she was summoning something. I had nowhere to run. I hid in the pantry. It was dark and damp, and I could hear her pacing just outside, like a predator waiting for prey. A sickly sweet scent oozed in through the crack under the door. Sweetness mixed with rot, you know, she whispered. True sweetness doesn't come from sugar. It comes from that soft little part inside people. You, my little sunshine, are the sweetest of all. I covered my ears. I didn't want to hear any more. I waited through the night. At dawn, everything was silent. I slowly crept out. The kitchen was empty. One window was shattered. On the floor, cookie crumbs and dried blood stained the wooden boards. And a trail of wet, bloody footprints, bare, small, strange, led all the way to the backyard. The prints were slick with some kind of mucus and hair. They stopped in front of the old storage shed that had been locked for years. The door was slightly ajar. A wave of rot rolled out from the crack. It wasn't the cookie smell I remembered. It was sickly sweet like rotten candy and spoiled meat. I hesitated, then pushed the door open. The shed was dark, lit only by a shaft of moonlight coming through a hole in the roof. The light fell across piles of junk and something slippery beneath my shoe. I looked down. It was the rotting head of a rabbit. The eyes were gouged out. The ears were snipped into thin ribbons, hanging from the wall-like ornaments. The whole place was a slaughterhouse. Corpses of rabbits, cats, squirrels, even skinned dogs, were scattered across the floor. Against the wall was a long table, stained dark with blood. On it lay saws, knives, pliers, each one still smeared with raw meat and fur. Then I saw a basket. Inside were cookie cutters, shaped like hearts and teeth. Beside it, a wooden box full of unbaked dough, pinkish, red-streaked, mixed with minced meat, blood, and bone meal. Maggots writhed over the mix. I nearly threw up. I turned to run, but the shed door was empty. Grandma was gone. Only the last cookie she had shoved into my mouth remained, lying on the floor. The chocolate chips were leaking thick, red syrup. I ran to the neighbors, borrowed a phone, called my parents. When they arrived with the police, I told them Grandma had disappeared. But my parents looked confused. They said Grandma had gone missing 2 years ago. They never told me because they didn't want to upset me. And they hadn't called her in days. The police searched the house, sealed it off. But they found no body, no trace of her. It was like she never existed. Except for the blood-soaked shed, and a dozen cookies filled with bone dust. Even now, I still dream of her smile. Dream of those cookies, reaching out with tiny fingers, crawling into my mouth. And every time I smell cookies on the street, I wonder what's really inside. I always admired my grandfather. He was tall, strong, with a deep voice that rumbled like distant thundercom, but powerful. When I was a kid, he'd take me to the stream by the forest to collect stones, split firewood with an axe, or lie with me on the rooftop to stargaze. There was something in him that my father never had, a kind of strength that was both unshakable and tender. His 60th birthday was a big deal. The whole family showed up, uncles, aunts, cousins, even distant relatives we hadn't seen in years. The living room was decked out with balloons and streamers, the table piled with dishes, and the cake was a towering strawberry cream monstrosity. I remember the laughter, the crowd, the noise, but in my eyes, there was only one image burned into my mind, my grandfather sitting in his chair, and the thing standing behind him. It was tall, lanky, almost fused to his shadow, draped in a tattered, hooded robe that looked like it had been dragged through centuries, the fabric worn thin and fraying at the edges, trailing on the floor like it had never known sunlight. The hood hid most of its face, but what peeked out was a dry, yellowed skull-like bone left out in the desert for 1,000 years. Its eye sockets were deep, hollow, and empty. Yet somehow, I felt them staring, not just looking, but watching. A cold, quiet gaze that seemed to seep into your bones and stay there. It didn't speak. It didn't move. Just stood there, skeletal hand resting on my grandfather's shoulder. No one else noticed. No one but me. I rubbed my eyes, hoping it was some trick of the light. but it was still there and moving, unreal. The fingers of its hand pressed firmly into my grandfather's shoulder, like they belonged there. I ran to my mom, tugged at her sleeve, whispering, "Mom, there's someone next to Grandpa. It's weird. It looks like a skeleton." She frowned, brushing me off. "Don't talk nonsense. It's your grandfather's birthday. Don't cause trouble." I tried to say more, but she had already disappeared back into the crowd, like she hadn't heard a word. My chest felt tight. All night, I couldn't shake the feeling. That thing never left my grandfather's side. Whenever he moved, it followed, its bony hands still clutching his shoulder, as if they were bound together. I couldn't stop staring. And then, it turned, slowly, deliberately, its empty gaze locked onto mine. It had no eyes, but somehow, I knew it was looking at me. It did nothing, just stood there, head tilting slightly, the bony grin stretching across its jaw like it was trying to mimic a human smile. But it was all wrong, dry, stiff, and so cold it made my skin crawl. My chest tightened like I'd just swallowed ice water. I stumbled back a step. After that day, Grandpa started to change. He used to wake up early for walks, tend to his garden, but within a week he was dizzy, short of breath. He even nearly fell down the stairs one morning. Everyone said it was just age catching up with him, but I knew better. That hand hadn't let go. I kept visiting him. Every time, it was there, the figure, the robe, the hand. Always just behind him, closer than a shadow, more real than anything else in the room. And slowly, I began to believe. It wasn't something I saw. It was something that was. Something that had chosen him. A year later, Grandpa was in the hospital. The doctors couldn't find anything fatal, but his mind was unraveling fast. He mumbled to the walls, screamed things like, "I'm not ready." Once, when I came to visit, he grabbed my hand and said, "Tell him I need more time. Tell him I'm not ready to go." The family said he was delusional, dementia, maybe. But I knew he was talking about it. About the thing that never left his side. And it stayed with him for 5 long years, until the day he died. He passed quietly, no struggle, just peace. Like something heavy had finally been lifted. That day, the sun was bright sharply out of place, after years of sickness and dread. Everyone wore black. I stood at the edge of the funeral crowd, watching his coffin lowered into the ground. That's when I saw it again, the figure, standing not far from the grave, silent and still. Like it had come to personally see him off. Sunlight struck its bones, but it cast no shadow. And when the crowd began to leave, I turned back one last time. It was gone, not walked away, not moved, gone. As if it had never been there. I stood before my grandfather's grave for a long time, not saying a word. The wind brushed past my ears, and still, I heard nothing. Just one thought remained in my mind. He's finally been released. It's been many years. I've never seen that thing again. But whenever someone in the family grows old, when their time seems near, I always find myself watching their shoulders just a little too closely. But now, I see nothing. In our family photo album, there's an old, yellowed photograph. In it, a weary-faced man with gentle eyes cradles a beaming baby in a garden, while a woman stands nearby, smiling at them. That man was my grandfather, Edward. The woman was my grandmother, Irene. And the baby that was my father, Henry. I always thought it was just an ordinary family photo, until many years later, just before she passed, my grandmother gave a faded journal to my father. That's when the truth began to surface. My grandfather, Edward, was drafted shortly after my father was born and sent off to the battlefields of Europe. It was a time of blood and fire, when every letter from the front could be the last. In the winter of 1944, with the war at its peak, my grandmother received a cold, official notice from the military. It read, "Captain Edward Snow was killed in action in northern France. Body unrecovered. She collapsed to the floor, eyes hollow. But she knew she couldn't break. She still had a 1-year-old child to raise. She swallowed her grief, clenched her teeth, and poured all the love she had left into my father. 2 years later, the war finally ended. It was a summer afternoon in 1946. The sun spilled like molten gold across the streets and front lawns, and the air was thick with the scent of fresh-cut grass and damp soil. My grandmother knelt in the yard, trimming the flower beds, sweat trickling down her face. My father played nearby with a small wooden car. Then, from the light, a shadowed figure emerged, stepping toward the garden, tall, lean, his steps slow but steady. And then, in a voice my grandmother would never forget, he said, "Irene, I'm home." She looked up, squinting into the sunlight. She couldn't see his face clearly at first, only that he wore a tattered military uniform, caked with mud and blood. His face was worn and exhausted, but hauntingly familiar. She stood, trembling, and stepped forward. It was him. It was Edward. His uniform was filthy and torn, his face sunken and tired, but his eyes were just as gentle as she remembered. She rushed into his arms, clutching him tightly, sobbing uncontrollably. He smiled softly and reached out to stroke her hair. That night, the three of them sat together at the dinner table for the first time in years. My grandmother had made her signature beef stew and pumpkin soup. My grandfather said little. He just watched them quietly, eating, humming a familiar tune under his breath. After dinner, he reached for her hand and asked her to dance. She hesitated, then smiled and nodded. They danced right there in the living room, the old phonograph playing a faint melody. My grandfather twirled her gently, over and over. At one point, he picked up my father and brought him into the dance. In her journal, my grandmother wrote, "In that moment, I felt like I had the whole world in my arms." But my grandfather was different. He wasn't as light-hearted as he once was. He rarely spoke, avoided friends and family, saying only, "I just need a few quiet days." My grandmother understood. War changed people, but she was grateful. He was home, and that was enough. She didn't ask questions. The following days were the happiest of her life. Each morning, she woke to see Edward sitting by the window, watching the sunlight fall across their son's face. Each night, he softly hummed that melody to lull Henry to sleep. There was always a trace of sorrow in his eyes, but she never pressed. Perhaps she didn't want to know. Then came Sunday, 1 week later. That morning, Edward seemed restless, his eyes flicking to the clock again and again. My grandmother noticed, but said nothing. After lunch, he suddenly took her hand and began to dance with her again in the living room. His voice trembled, but he still hummed the melody. Then he stopped mid-step, looked deep into her eyes, and said, I only asked him for 7 days." She froze. "What do you mean?" she asked, confused. But he didn't answer. He just pulled her into a tight embrace, stroked her hair, and whispered, "I love you so much. I'll always love you." Then he kissed her. She felt something tighten in her throat like a scream she couldn't push out. He gently let her go, a single tear rolling down his cheek. Then he turned to their son, lifted him into his arms, and kissed him on the forehead. "My son, I will always love you." My grandmother broke down. She rushed forward and grabbed his hand. "Edward, no matter what it is, we can face it together. Please, just tell me." But he only smiled quietly. "Just remember, I'll always love you." Then he turned and opened the front door. A blinding white light poured into the house, illuminating his back. The scene looked exactly like the day he first appeared. My grandmother ran to the door, but by the time she reached it, the light had vanished and he was gone. She screamed his name, ran through the front yard, and down the street, but Edward never came back. She wrote the entire story in her journal, and gave it to my father during the final year of her life. "Those 7 days," she told him, "were the last time your grandfather ever walked this world. She never woke again after that. I read the journal and asked my father, "Did Grandpa really come back?" He paused, then shook his head. "I don't remember that week." But then he looked up, as if digging through the dust of a forgotten memory. "I do remember. Someone picking me up in the living room. He spun me around and kissed me. His hands were ice cold. But it didn't feel cold at all. It felt warm, and it felt familiar." As he said this, his eyes held a sorrowful kind of peace, and I could only sit there and stare at the man in the old photo. I said to my father, maybe Grandpa clawed his way back from hell, just for a chance to spend one last week with the people he loved. My father gazed at the photo for a long time, and then, slowly, a smile curled at his lips. We sat side by side, looking at that worn, weary, but gentle man, almost like he never left at all. A breeze drifted through the room, and from somewhere far away, I heard the soft echo of that familiar melody. 7 days, enough to remember for a lifetime.